Today we will follow up on my previous video where we discussed what separates a great keyboard action from an inferior keyboard action. And we'll dig into one aspect, perhaps the most important thing to consider, the number of keys. Should you get 25, 37, mini keys, full-size keys, 49, 61, 73, 76, fully weighted, semi-weighted or unweighted keys, perhaps an 88-note keyboard. Yeah, a lot of things and options to consider. Which one is right for you? I'll help you decide when we go through all of the different sizes, and I'll give you my pros and cons for each. Let's start with 25-note keys, which is the most common type you find on the really compact USB MIDI controllers and some of the really compact synthesizers as well that are designed for working on a desktop. And 25 keys is 2 octaves, that much. This is a 61 I have here for reference, but it'll be that much of the keyboard. It's fine for playing one-handed stuff. You can't really play two hands at the same time because it's too cramped. So if that's something you want to do, you'll be needing to look for something a little bit larger. But for playing one hand at a time, programming in your bass line, then the chords, the melody separately is perfectly fine and quite good for bashing in beats and so on a drum kit as well. And the nice thing about the 25 is they are very compact. You can chuck it in a rucksack if you're going to a gig or going over to a friend's house for a jam or something, or going off on vacation and want to take a little keyboard with you. 25 is the perfect size. Also, the most affordable MIDI keyboards and synthesizers tend to have 25 keys. Stepping up then, we have a slightly unusual keyboard size. That's with 37 keys, which if I've done my maths right, would be 3 octaves. So from there to there on this particular 61-note keyboard. And that's a pretty useful size. It's starting to get slightly larger, so you won't be able to chuck it in your rucksack if you're going anywhere, but you can actually start to use 2 hands together here, which is the way I like to compose and make my own tracks. I usually like to play the bass and some chords at the same time. What you will more often see, I think, is actually 37-note keyboards, but with mini keys instead of full-size keys. So let's talk all about mini keys versus full-size keys. This particular synthesizer and the one over my shoulder have full-size keys. Now there is no standard in the dimensions, the length and the width of the keys. If you were to measure between the octaves, that distance also does tend to vary between brands, actions and key beds. But generally, a full-size keyboard is more or less roughly the same. And then we have mini keys that are about half the size. A lot of guys and girls tend to hate on mini keys. They are really despised by a lot of players. Now, personally, I don't have a problem with the size and can adapt quite easily to the mini keys. And the advantage of mini keys, of course, is that for a given footprint, for a given size of your keyboard or synth, you can cram in more keys if you use mini keys than if you use full-size keys. And for example, I'd rather have 37 mini keys in the same space that 25 full-size keys would take up. But there is a major disadvantage with mini keys. Unfortunately, they tend to be much lower quality, cheaply produced. They tend to feel a bit flimsy, and I don't think they are as durable as full-size keys. And if you read Facebook groups and so on, there's a lot of reports about mini keys simply breaking and snapping off where they are hinged. That's not a good thing and not something I want to deal with. There are some exceptions. Some manufacturers do have nice, high quality mini keys, and that's a really glorious thing. For example, the mini keys on the Roland Jupiter XM are exceptional and feel as high quality as their full-size counterparts. But in general, mini keys are really cheaply made, and for that reason, I personally tend to avoid them. Not because of the size, but because of the quality and construction issues. Stepping up again, we are now in the 49 full-size keys category, which is from here to here. So 1 octave less than a 61 note keyboard. That's actually 4 octaves, and this is a great size, one of my absolute favorites actually for a desktop DAW music production system. A lot of my favorite synths also had 49 note keyboards, like the Nord lead, for example, and that's quite okay. It's enough keys for you to play comfortably with 2 hands. Another thing I ought to mention is that you have octave shift buttons. So if you want to go higher than that, you have the buttons to do it. Obviously a little bit awkward in the middle of a performance, but if you're recording something into your DAW, then you can use those to get a much greater virtual range of keys. But 49 for me is a real sweet spot. It fits nicely on the desk without taking up too much room. I can do quite sophisticated two-handed arrangements and figure out ideas for songs and tracks. So yeah, I really do love a 49. Also, by the time you get into the territory of 49 note controller keyboards and synthesizers, they tend to be higher quality actions and key beds than what you typically see on 25 or 37 note keys as well, if you're prepared to pay a little bit more anyway. We didn't really talk about the type of the action, but all of the keyboard action sizes we've talked about so far have synth action keys, just like this one, which tend to have quite a sort of shallow travel and quite easy and light to depress the keys, which is pretty much what you want for playing synthesizer, drum, organ, string sounds, and so on. But as we step up to the larger keyboard ranges, we have the options of weighted keyboards, weighted actions, hammer action keyboards they're sometimes called, which introduce weights into the keys, or even hammer mechanisms like a real piano to give you the feel of playing a real acoustic piano. That's really nice if you're playing piano, but it does suck if you're playing organ or synth sounds. I really don't like weighted piano actions for that. Okay, let's talk about the keyboard we have right here, which is 61 keys, as is the Nord Electro that I have behind me. And I would say 61 keys is the de facto standard for a synthesizer action. We had it on the D50, the DX7, the Korg M1. A whole endless list of classic synthesizers use a 61 note keyboard. Why is this so popular then? Well, you get 5 octaves. And there's your highest note, there's your lowest note, and that's a pretty massive range. With that amount of range, you can play most pop songs. I would say you can play all pop songs without any issues at all. And remember, again, you have the octave shift if you want to go higher or lower. Maybe 61, not enough if you're doing advanced classical or jazz music. But for me, it's really nice to have 61 keys, plenty of space for two-handed playing, playing way down or way up. Another thing you can start doing as you get into 61 note keyboards is splitting the keyboard. There isn't really enough space on 49 note keyboards to do this, but as we get to 61 and above, we can do keyboard splits. And if you don't know what that is, it basically means that I can divide the keyboard in two, and then on the left part, I can have, for example, a bass sound. On the right part, I can have, for example, a nice soft pad sound, a string sound, or a piano, and have two different sounds playing at the same time. That becomes possible when you get to 61 notes and above. The disadvantage or the drawback of a 61 note is they start to take up a lot of space on your desk. If this is something you're going to be using as a MIDI controller, as you're programming stuff into your DAW, your sequencer, 61 can take up a lot of desk real estate, leaving very little space for your mouse and your keyboard, especially like on this one, if you have the pitch bend and the modulation wheels to the left of the keys, it's starting to take up a lot of space. But this is still a very nice size for transporting around and doing gigs with. It's not particularly cumbersome to transport a 61 note synthesizer. Stepping up again then, we have our 73, 76 note keyboards. There is some variations here. Some manufacturers provide 73, others provide 76. But again, this is a fairly rare size of keyboard. It's not all that common. A lot of manufacturers give you either a 61 note or an 88 note keyboard action on their synthesizers, workstations, and so on. But 73, 76 is really luxurious. Gives you a little bit more at the top and the bottom, of course, and if you're splitting it, it gives you tons of room on the left hand and the right hand for those two different sounds. So that's really nice. The Nord Electro comes in a 73 note version, which is excellent if you're using the organ and splitting the keyboard in the middle to give you the lower manual and the upper manual. It's a really nice choice. And again, these 73, 76 note actions tend to be quite premium as well, so they're high quality with a really nice feel to them as well. So yeah, that's a size I really like. Also still fairly portable, but it's not something you'd perhaps want to have on your studio desk unless you had some solution where you could slide it in and out under the desk, because they start to take up a lot of space when you get to 73, 76. Also, you need to be really aware where the mod wheels pitch bend are positioned. I actually, when you start looking at larger keyboards with a lot of keys, I like it when they move these above the keys instead of having it to the left, which makes the keyboard even longer. What's your favorite number of keys? Please do let us know in the comments below. Finally then, we have 88 note keyboards, synthesizers and digital pianos. This is the exact same size as the vast majority of acoustic upright pianos and grand pianos. So that's absolutely excellent and very important if you're intending to play advanced classical compositions and your own jazz performances, perhaps, where you really do need the full range for effect with the very lowest and the very highest notes. Although for me, not something I usually tend to play, so I often think myself that an 88 is a bit of a waste of space. It's got a whole bunch of keys at the very bottom and the very top that I rarely use, that sound like that at the top, or like that at the bottom. I very rarely use those keys, although some software instruments have key switches which are in the very lowest octave of an 88 note keyboard span that you can use to change the characteristics of the sound. So in that case, it can be quite nice to have an 88 note action. Another thing about the 88 note keyboards that you need to understand is that usually, more often than not, they have weighted keyboard actions, as I mentioned earlier in the video. This is to simulate the feel of playing a real acoustic piano, which is a great thing if that's what you need to do. I'd highly recommend the weighted keyboard action for playing piano, Rhodes, for example. But for other sound categories, it's really not ideal, according to me anyway. I personally don't enjoy playing, for example, snappy synthesizer leads or snappy brass sounds on a weighted action. It just feels sluggish and unresponsive and slow to me, and not something I enjoy. So there are pros and cons with a weighted action, but now you know all about it. Now, when we start talking about 88s with weighted keyboard actions, now we're talking about some seriously large and heavy instruments. That's right, an 88 note weighted keyboard might be something like 15 to 20 kilograms perhaps. This 61 in comparison is about 8 or 9, I do believe. So yeah, you have a lot more issues transporting it around. And just carrying an 88 can be quite cumbersome, especially with the pitch stick or the mod wheels on the left. It can become rather long and large, and even carrying it through doorways, I sometimes forget how long it is and clunk it into the door entrance as I'm passing through, which is not a good thing, obviously. So transporting an 88 can be a little bit awkward. Also, it can be too long to fit on the back seat of a car, for example. So even though it's the most glorious way to experience playing a piano sound, for portability, it's not actually ideal. Another thing, of course, is the expense. When we start getting up to nice quality premium 88 note weighted actions, yeah, you're going to pay $1,000 or upwards for something with really nice quality. So that's another thing to consider. So there you have my thoughts on the pros and cons of the various sizes of the MIDI keyboard controllers, synthesizers, arrangers, digital pianos, and so on. I also have a video that goes in depth into the other characteristics that you need to keep in mind when choosing an instrument based on its action, key bed, some of the things to have in mind when you're testing and evaluating the action. So I'll leave a link to that video down in the video description. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found the video helpful and informative. I'll see you next time. Cheerio.